Crash course video, we will be covering the American Civil War. So, what were some causes of the American Civil War? The cause of the American Civil War was the American Civil War was the result of several decades of sectional tensions between the North and the South. The main legislative holding between the North and the South was the Missouri Compromise, which stated that all states above the latitude 3630 would be free, while all states south of that would hold votes to determine the legality of slavery. The purpose of the Missouri Compromise was to maintain the congressional balance between the northern and southern states. At the time, the U.S. was in a time where compromises dominated the political scene. Secondly, the abolitionist movement was growing internally within the United States. The Dred Scott case declared that all blacks, slaves as well as free, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. Abolitionists and a grand majority of the North would become enraged at the decision at which slavery is legally permitted everywhere in the United States. The abolitionist movement would grow as Northerners realized that compromise was not an option. Frederick Douglass, a major abolitionist, even stated, "My hopes are never as bright as now," reflecting the negative national attention that the decision received. Attention on the issue of slavery is created with the Compromise of 1850, where California is allowed to join as a free state. The slave trade was also effectively abolished within Washington, D.C., but a compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, was passed. In the Fugitive Slave Act, states were to capture and return escaped slaves to their owners. Anyone caught aiding slaves were to be fined $500 and additionally denied the right to a jury trial. Southern states then became angry when the tariffs of 1828-1832 were passed, which effectively inhibited the South's cotton economy based on the trade of cotton with Britain. This led to the nullification crisis of 1832, where South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun believed that the state could ignore federal law, thus nullifying it. Once a Republican nominee, Abraham Lincoln, was elected as president, South Carolina began to hold talks on secession. South Carolina was the first to secede on December 20th, 1860, and soon after, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas joined in order to form the Confederate States of America.
The Anaconda Plan was the plan to set a naval blockade of the important ports of the South to where they couldn't export cotton and import war supplies. Their economy would then turn into suffer. It was to make South surrender before any major battles, and it was to control the Mississippi River and 6,000 troops and gunboats along its waters. It would divide the South along the Mississippi River and disorganize the Confederate troops and allow Union troops to attack. Abraham Lincoln used his plan to hurt the Confederacy and take action on ground. Waiting for the Confederacy to surrender would take too long, and the tensions between the North and the South were higher than ever. The bloodshed was unnecessary, and Lincoln's political stances would preserve the Union even with force. The Battle of Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson refuses to surrender to the Confederacy at Fort Sumter. Southern artillery fired, and the troops returned the fire. No bloodshed happened, and then Anderson surrenders. Beauregard developed military skills under Anderson's instruction at West Point. It would encourage the secession of Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. West Virginia would stay loyal to the Union, creating a split in the state, and Northerners who wanted to let the South go were enraged, boost Union enlistments. April 12, 1861, the Battle of Bruin led President Lincoln to push General Irvin McDowell to attack the Confederate forces. The battle convinced Lincoln's administration, and the North would cost a lot of money. It showed the North that the war would be long and gruesome. For the Union, Lincoln removed McDowell from command and replaced George B. McClellan to retrain and reorganize the troops defending Washington and the Army of Potomac. The Battle of Shiloh. The failed surprise attack on the Union position, but it failed. Confederates were outnumbered, and Beauregard was initially successful, and Union lines stiffened. Realizing Beauregard was outnumbered and having already suffered a lot of casualties, they broke out in contact with the Yankees to begin a retreat to Corinth. Victory for the Unions. 23,746 men died, while 13,047 men were Union soldiers.
Also known as the Gettysburg Campaign. Robert E. Lee wanted to threaten northern cities, weaken the North's appetite for war, and win a major battle on the northern soil to ultimately strengthen the peace movement in the North. The battle lasted 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd. On July 1st, 1883, Union Army and Confederate armies began to fight. Cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford slowed the Confederate advance until Union infantry arrived. However, Confederate reinforcements arrived as well. Eventually, 30,000 Confederates defeated 20,000 Yankees. The Union Army fell back through Gettysburg to the hills south of the town, Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. On day 2 of the battle, 90,000 Union troops were defending a range of hills south of Gettysburg. The Confederates gained ground throughout the evening, but the Union defenders still held strong positions by the end of the day. On July 3rd, fighting resumed on Cope's Hill and cavalry battles raged to the east and south. In an event known as Pickett's Charge, 12,000 Confederate troops attacked the center of Union lines at Cemetery Ridge. Artillery and Union rifle fire lines repulsed the Confederate attacks. The South suffered heavy casualties. This ultimately led to Lee retreating back to the South. 4 months after the battle, President Lincoln held the dedication ceremony for Gettysburg Soldiers National Cemetery to honor the fallen Union soldiers and redefine the purpose of the war in the Gettysburg Address. Ultimately, it was a major victory for the North. It became the turning point in the war. Lee's forces were severely hurt, and it forced Lee to be defensive for the rest of the war. Sherman's march to the sea began after the fall of Atlanta, when General William T. Sherman marched towards Savannah in a 300-mile trek in which his troops and himself ravaged and destroyed farms, railroads, telegraph lines, and factories in the South. Ultimately, it was done to hurt the morale of the South and make a bold statement that the Union was the stronger of the two. Ultimately, Sherman's march to the sea was a major success. They captured Savannah and demoralized the South and their willingness to fight. Robert E. Lee was forced to surrender at Appomattox after being cut off from food supplies, and because his whole army was trapped and encircled by the Union forces. Robert E. Lee was considering surrendering to General Grant. General E. Lee surrendered at William McLean's home after Ulysses S. Grant offered or requested two times for the surrender. Surrender reinstituted federal domination, and the Union redistributed their forces throughout the South.
At the home front, African Americans, men and women, most importantly women, were serving as nurse cooks and blacksmiths. Confederates feared slave revolt and avoided arming African Americans. They also served as spies and scouts and were nicknamed the Black Dispatches. African Americans served both sides but didn't serve the South until 1865. The enlistees for the South were too small compared to the North. The Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Antietam attracted and gained a great amount in numbers to the Union Army. Women played the role as spies for both the Confederacy and the Union. This was done by flirting at parties and other social events while they smuggled supplies under large hoop skirts. For example, Confederate spy Emmeline Piggott would discover military information by hosting and entertaining at dinner parties in her house. She would smuggle the information to the Confederates via secret hiding spots at her house or by crossing into enemy lines. Women also played the role of war relief workers, whom of which would gather and raise money for medical supplies, food, clothing, bedding, basic necessities for those involved in the war. Women also played a role in disguising themselves as soldiers in the war, and due to the fact that they were forbidden to serve, so they disguised as men. So this meant that they changed their names to more of a masculine one and disguised themselves as men. Most women were only discovered if they were being treated for wounds, and if they were discovered, they were dismissed.
The war ended after the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederate States were eventually admitted back into the Union. However, they needed time to recover from what they experienced as a result of the war. During the Reconstruction era in the United States, there was a major breakthrough for the African Americans that were in the United States in the form of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to those that were naturalized or born in the United States, and this included former slaves. And the 15th Amendment granted suffrage to African American men, but not women. Despite these three amendments that were passed, full African American equality and freedom couldn't be reached because of the other things that were happening at the time. That prevented the full equality and freedom of African Americans at this time were sharecropping, the Black Codes, and groups such as the KKK. An important factor that especially inhibited the freedom and equality of African Americans were the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws made everyday life for African Americans tougher because it enforced racial segregation in the South during this Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction era in the United States ended with the Compromise of 1877. This compromise pulled all federal military troops out of the southern states. Although slavery ended after the Civil War, the issue regarding the equality and freedom of African Americans continued to be one in the later history of the United States.